Hello and welcome to Part 6 of our Research 101 tutorial series, Scholarship is a Conversation. In the previous tutorials in this series, we've discussed how to find a research topic, the different kinds of information you will encounter while doing research, how to find information online in the library, how to evaluate the information you find to make sure it's current, relevant, accurate, and authoritative, and how to cite the information you use to credit its original owner. In this episode, we will conclude the series by talking about how the research we do forms a small part in a great conversation between scholars, linking backwards for generations. So what do we mean when we say scholarship is a conversation? Well, scholarship, or the act of creating new knowledge through research, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It occurs among a community of scholars who don't always agree on the conclusions drawn from evidence or data. Hence, the creation of new knowledge occurs in a sort of dialogue between different scholars who draw different conclusions based on different analyses of data or interpretations of evidence. Sometimes, this dialogue occurs among contemporary scholars in in-person settings, such as scholarly conferences or informal arguments. One modern example of such a dialogue can be found in the debates between theoretical physicists Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. Bohr disagreed with some of Einstein's arguments regarding his theory of relativity, and these arguments, which were sometimes quite sharp, carried over to their students, forming different schools of thought within the discipline. However, not all scholarly dialogues occur in person. You can see scholars debating arguments in the letters sections of scholarly journals, on social media, and even in the literature reviews and introductions of scholarly journal articles and books. Indeed, in some cases, the conversation, if we wish to call it that, may seem a bit one-sided, as only one of the parties involved is among the living. For example, consider a philosopher who makes arguments in dialogue with those of his disciplinary predecessors, such as Kant, Hegel, and Aristotle. These can't really be called conversations per se, as half the conversants are dead, but we consider them a dialogue nonetheless, because while the scholars themselves aren't interacting with each other, their ideas and arguments are. And this is essentially true in all fields. While genuinely new ideas and concepts do get explored, the majority of scholarly work builds off of or argues against the work of previous scholars. In some cases, this occurs as scholars, armed with new evidence or theoretical approaches, seek to refute previous findings. In other cases, new evidence allows scholars to further pursue areas of study that had been previously stalled due to lack of evidence or the tools necessary to properly analyze it. Finally, in still other cases, scholars identify gaps in the scholarship, areas of study, groups of people, a particular species, etc., that hasn't been previously studied or studied as closely as other topics. These scholars choose to expand our understanding in that particular region. In all of these cases, scholars acknowledge the work of their predecessors in the field and seek to show how their own work adds to our knowledge in that particular area of study, while also situating their own work in contrast to the work of those who came before. In modern academia, the way scholars make these acknowledgments and situate their work is through a literature review. So what is a literature review? Well, first off, don't let the name fool you. We're not talking about a book report here. The literature in question here is scholarly literature, peer-reviewed articles and books on a given topic. Historians actually don't even use the term literature review at all. They prefer the term historiography, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. In any case, a literature review is a summary of important and relevant scholarly literature on a given topic. And please note the terms important and relevant. Literature reviews are not necessarily meant to be exhaustive. On some newer or more obscure research topics, there may be only a few pieces of scholarly literature currently published. However, on heavily studied topics, in certain fields such as psychology, where publication is heavy, you may find hundreds or even thousands of pieces of literature on a given topic. Your literature review is not intended to be an exhaustive study of everything ever published on your given topic since the beginning of time. Instead, it is meant to focus on those works that most closely align with your own topic, and which have had the greatest impact in the field. If you're curious on how to determine an article's impact, go back and review the section on relevance back in Research 101, Part 4, Evaluating Information. Once you've identified the key literature related to your topic of study, The next step is to read that literature, paying careful attention to how the research was done in the past, paying particular attention to what, if anything, has been overlooked in the past. Are there gaps in the scholarship? Are there new tools or evidence now available which might change our perspective on the conclusions drawn in the past? Finally, always keep in mind what your own scholarship hopes to add to the ongoing discussion and where it will fit among the work already done. Okay, so that's what a literature review is. Why do we do them at all? First off, literature reviews demonstrate to the readers, and thus to the scholarly community at large, that the author of the paper or book in question is an expert in their field, that they are familiar with the significant scholarship in their field, and can confidently explain where their research falls within the larger landscape of study. In essence, it's how you prove you've done your homework in this area, and can be reliably expected to know what you're talking about. Second, doing a literature review helps you, as the researcher, determine whether or not your original research is actually original. There's nothing worse than going to all the trouble of putting together a study, getting IRB approval, collecting data, analyzing that data, and drawing conclusions, only to realize that someone did exactly the same thing you did 15 years ago. Suddenly you aren't doing original research, you're doing a confirmation study. And while confirmation studies are crucial for establishing research findings, if your goal was originality, it's back to square one. Finally, creating a literature review is a form of service to future researchers on your particular topic. Just as you will have found sources for your review in the reviews of other studies you read, future researchers will be able to draw on the sources you found and used in their own research. So doing a literature review is kind of a way of paying it forward for future researchers in your field. So that's the what and why. How do you put a literature review together? Well, that depends. At its most basic level, a literature review is the summarizing of a bunch of different scholarly literature on a given topic. How you choose to summarize these works, what you will emphasize or pay particular attention to, depends a lot on what you yourself are researching. This will also affect how you choose to organize these sources within your paper. Most academic papers or journal articles have a section dedicated to the literature review, so you don't get a whole lot of choice in where your literature review will be located, but you will have considerable latitude on how you organize your sources in that section. You can choose to organize your sources chronologically, beginning with the earliest source you're citing and moving by date up to the most recent study. This has the effect of showing the way our understanding of this particular topic has changed over time, with the implication that your own research is the next contribution in this line of study. This is probably the simplest form of organization for a literature review and is often chosen for that reason. Another way to organize materials in a literature review is by methodology. When we say methodology, we mean how was the research done? Did they do a survey? Was there a laboratory experiment, clinical studies, field work? Different methodological approaches can yield different perspectives on a topic, and perhaps your own methodology is markedly different from the other ways your topic has been studied. In this case, arranging previous scholarship by the methods they used to do the research makes sense. Finally, you may have decided to arrange your literature review by the theoretical approach used by the researchers to interpret the data they collected. Theories are models used in a variety of different disciplines to describe how a certain behavior or phenomena might be expected to play out. Researchers use theoretical approaches to design research projects or experiments, and can also use theory to interpret the resulting data or evidence. If your project uses a theoretical approach that contrasts from previous approaches, you might want to organize your literature review by the theoretical approach used. However, your decision should be based on what makes the most sense for your specific project. Sir Isaac Newton once wrote that if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, meaning that his own major discoveries, such as the invention of calculus, depended directly on the discoveries made by those who had come before him and had influenced his own work. Literature reviews allow us to give credit to the scholars behind the body of work that has shaped our own understandings, while also allowing us to show where our own contributions to that body of work lie. By doing the research that allows us to create literature reviews, we gain the knowledge necessary to enter into the conversation with those giants and hold our own, maybe even making a few new arguments ourselves in the process. So come on in and join the conversation. When you start a research project, you never know just who you might end up talking to.